Stephen dropped his fork. It clattered loudly against the expensive china plate. His hands began to shake. On the television screen in front of him, a young boy sat on a dirty street corner. The child's clothes were torn and filthy. His feet were bare and covered in dust. But none of that mattered to Stephen. What made his heart stop was the boy's left hand. The camera zoomed closer. There, stretching from the boy's thumb to his wrist, was a long, jagged scar. It was exactly like Stephen's own scar. Same shape, same length, same position. "Sir, are you all right?" his assistant asked with worry in her voice. Stephen couldn't speak. He stood up quickly and moved closer to the TV screen. His eyes grew wide. His breathing became fast and shallow. The scar was not just similar. It was identical. Stephen stared at his own left hand. The scar he had carried since childhood stared back at him. He had gotten it so long ago that he barely remembered how. It was just always there, a part of him. But now, on this random Tuesday afternoon in his Lagos office, he was seeing that same scar on a homeless boy begging on the streets. "Find out everything about this documentary," Stephen said urgently. "Who made it? Where was it filmed? Who is that boy?" His assistant nodded quickly and rushed out of the room. Stephen sank back into his chair. His mind was spinning with confusion and impossible thoughts. He was one of the richest men in Nigeria. He owned buildings, businesses, and more money than he could spend in 3 lifetimes. People knew his name across the entire country. But none of that wealth could fill the emptiness in his heart. 9 years ago, Stephen had lost everything that truly mattered. His wife. His newborn son. Both vanished without a trace during what should have been a simple hospital transfer. The police searched for months. Private detectives followed every possible lead. But there were no answers. No clues. No hope. Eventually, Stephen had been forced to accept the terrible truth. His family was gone forever. He buried his grief in work. He built his business empire higher and higher, trying to fill the void inside him. But the pain never left. And now, on this ordinary day, he had seen something impossible. A boy with his exact scar. Stephen's assistant returned within an hour. "Sir, I have the information." "Tell me everything," Stephen said. "The documentary was filmed yesterday in Makoko. The boy's name is David. He's about 9 years old. He lives on the streets alone. Nobody knows where he came from or who his family is." Stephen's hands trembled as he wrote down the details. Could it be possible? After 9 years of searching, 9 years of grief, could this boy somehow be connected to him? Stephen canceled all his afternoon meetings. His assistant stared at him in shock. He never canceled meetings. Never. But today was different. Something deep inside him was pulling him forward. He had to find that boy. "Get my car ready," Stephen said. "We're going to Makoko." His driver looked worried when Stephen told him where they were going. "Sir, that area is very dangerous. Many criminals live there. You're wearing an expensive suit and gold watch. It's not safe." "I don't care," Stephen said firmly. "Drive." The journey through Lagos took nearly 2 hours. Traffic filled every road. Cars honked endlessly. Street vendors moved between vehicles selling water, bread, and phone cards. Finally, they reached Makoko. Stephen looked out the window at the shocking scene before him. Wooden houses stood on tall stilts above dark, dirty water. Small boats floated between them. Trash covered the water's surface. Children splashed in the polluted water while women washed clothes on narrow wooden walkways. Stephen stepped out of his sleek black car. Immediately, people turned to stare. A rich man in a sharp suit didn't belong here. Some young men approached slowly, eyeing his gold watch with suspicious looks. Stephen ignored them. He began asking strangers if they knew a boy named David. Most people walked away quickly. They didn't trust outsiders asking questions. But an old woman sitting by a small fire raised her hand. "I know the boy," she said. "David sleeps under the bridge near the market. He's a good child. He doesn't steal. He only begs for food to survive." Stephen thanked her and gave her money. Her eyes widened at the amount. She blessed him over and over. Stephen walked toward the bridge with his driver following closely behind him. Under the bridge, darkness pressed in from all sides. The air smelled terrible like urine and dampness. Old blankets and broken boxes littered the ground. Several people lay sleeping even though it was daytime. "David," Stephen called out. His voice echoed off the concrete pillars. Nobody answered at first. Then Stephen saw movement behind a large pillar. A small, thin figure slowly stood up. It was the boy from the documentary. In person, David looked even smaller and weaker than on television. His torn clothes hung loosely on his thin body. His bare feet were covered in dirt and cuts. But his eyes were bright and intelligent, watching Stephen with deep suspicion. Stephen knelt down to the boy's height. He offered a gentle smile. David didn't smile back. He only stared, cautious and wary. "Are you David?" Stephen asked softly. The boy nodded slowly. "How old are you?" David shrugged. "I think 9. But I don't know for sure. I don't know my birthday." Those words pierced Stephen's heart like a knife. How could a child grow up without knowing something so simple about himself? Stephen glanced at the boy's left hand. Even in the dim light, the scar was clearly visible. Slowly, Stephen raised his own left hand and held it out toward David. The boy's eyes went wide. He stared at Stephen's scar, then at his own, then back again. His small mouth opened in shock. "How did you get that scar?" Stephen asked gently, pointing to David's hand. The boy looked down at his left hand. "I don't know. It's always been there. I don't remember getting hurt." Stephen felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Do you have any family? A mother or father?" David shook his head sadly. "No. I've lived on the street since I was very small. An old beggar man took care of me, but he died 2 years ago. Now I'm alone." Tears threatened to spill from Stephen's eyes, but he held them back. He didn't want to frighten the child. "David, would you come with me?" Stephen asked softly. "I have a safe place with food, clean clothes, and a warm bed." Fear crossed the boy's face. He stepped back quickly. "Where are we going? Why do you want to help me?" "To my home," Stephen said. "I promise I won't hurt you." David looked around at the dark space under the bridge. Nobody there could protect him. Nobody there even cared. After several long moments, the boy whispered, "I'll go with you. But if you try to hurt me, I'll run away." "That's fair," Stephen said with respect. He understood why the boy didn't trust adults. They walked back to the car together. David's small feet hesitated when he saw the luxurious vehicle. He had never been inside a car before. When he sat down, he touched the soft leather seats with wonder, as if they might disappear beneath his fingers. Before leaving Makoko, Stephen stopped at a nearby shop. He bought new clothes for David. Shirts, trousers, underwear, socks, shoes, and a warm jacket. David clutched the clothes tightly against his chest. "Do I have to pay you back?" he asked nervously. "No," Stephen said gently. "They're gifts." When they arrived at Stephen's mansion, David gasped. The enormous house looked like a palace to him. 3 floors with shining white walls and a red roof. A beautiful fountain sparkled in the garden, surrounded by colorful flowers. David stood frozen, unable to believe his eyes. Stephen placed a comforting hand on the boy's shoulder and led him inside. The marble floors reflected bright chandeliers overhead. Elegant furniture and paintings filled every room. A kind woman named Ngozi approached with a warm smile. She was the housekeeper. "Ngozi, this is David," Stephen said. "Please help him take a bath and change into his new clothes." Ngozi took the boy's hand gently and led him upstairs to a large bathroom. It was bigger than the entire space under the bridge where David used to sleep. The white bathtub gleamed under the lights. Ngozi filled it with warm water and bubbles. David hesitated before stepping in. When he finally sat down, warmth wrapped around him like magic. He had only ever washed in dirty river water before. Ngozi washed his hair gently. Years of dirt, sweat, and street life swirled down the drain. After the bath, she helped him dress in his clean new clothes. She carefully applied medicine to the cuts and sores on his feet. When they finished, she took him downstairs to the dining room. David froze at the doorway. The long table was covered with food. Rice, chicken, vegetables, bread, fruits. More food than he had ever seen at once. Stephen sat waiting at the table. He smiled warmly and invited David to sit down. The boy sat slowly, unsure if he was really allowed to touch anything. Stephen filled a plate with food and handed it to him. At first, David hesitated. Then he took one bite and suddenly he was eating fast, almost desperately. He ate like someone who feared the food might be snatched away at any moment. Stephen watched with a breaking heart. He could only imagine the years of hunger that taught this boy to eat with such urgency. After dinner, Stephen brought David upstairs to a bedroom. The room had a soft bed with clean sheets and fluffy pillows. Toys sat neatly on shelves. A small desk stood beside the window. "This is your room now," Stephen said gently. David stared around in disbelief. He couldn't speak. He touched the blankets carefully, testing if they were real or just part of a dream. That night, after David fell asleep, Stephen sat outside the boy's door. He couldn't sleep. His mind kept racing with thoughts about the identical scar. It couldn't be a coincidence. Not one so perfect. Stephen's mind traveled back 9 years to a time when his life was completely different. Back then he wasn't rich. He was just a struggling businessman with big dreams. But he had something more valuable than money. He had his wife Mary. She was his joy, his heart, his everything. They had been so happy when Mary became pregnant. They eagerly waited for their first child, unaware of the tragedy coming. Mary went for an early scan. The doctor said she was carrying one baby, though the image wasn't very clear. When she went into early labor, the hospital was in chaos. There weren't enough nurses. Everything felt rushed and confused. In that confusion, Mary unknowingly delivered twins. 2 baby boys born minutes apart. But a corrupt doctor named Dr. Okoro had gambling debts and dangerous enemies. When he saw the twins, he saw an opportunity. He hid the first baby before anyone could see. He lied to the nurses and dismissed their questions. Mary only held the second baby, believing he was her only child. She was exhausted and weak, focused completely on the tiny infant she thought was her one son. Stephen remembered standing beside her, holding her hand as she cried tears of love over the baby. Then everything fell apart. The baby became sick and needed special treatment at another hospital. As the baby was being prepared for transfer, Dr. Okoro panicked. If Mary left, other doctors might discover the missing twin. So he arranged for criminals to intercept the ambulance. Mary was loaded into the ambulance, believing everything was normal. Stephen had to stay behind briefly to sign papers. She said she would call when they reached the other hospital. She never called. Stephen drove there anxiously, only to be told no ambulance had arrived. Panic consumed him. He called Mary repeatedly, but her phone just rang endlessly. He went to the police. They searched and questioned everyone. But there were no answers. No witnesses. No clues. Mary and the baby had vanished as if swallowed by the earth. Stephen hired private detectives until his savings were gone. Still nothing. Weeks turned to months. Months turned to years. Eventually he was forced to accept the unthinkable. His wife and child were gone forever. Now, sitting outside David's room, Stephen touched his own scar. Could this boy possibly be one of his lost twins? The next morning, Stephen took David to the best private hospital in Lagos. He had already called ahead and arranged everything. A kind nurse greeted them and took them into a small room. She took a cotton swab and gently rubbed the inside of David's cheek. The boy barely felt it. Then she took a sample from Stephen. The entire process took less than 10 minutes. The results will be ready in 3 days, the nurse said. Afterward, Stephen took David shopping. He bought more clothes, school uniforms, pajamas, books, a backpack, and even some small toys. David held his new belongings tightly. "Do I need to pay you back someday?" he asked again. Stephen shook his head with a smile. "No, David. Every child deserves these things." But deep inside, Stephen already knew the truth. His heart recognized this boy before any test could confirm it. The next 3 days felt like the longest of Stephen's life. He kept David home, wanting him safe and close. They spent the days reading, talking, and learning about each other. Stephen discovered that David knew some words from reading signs on the streets, but had never attended school. Despite his lack of education, the boy learned incredibly fast. Stephen was amazed by his intelligence and determination. Stephen also told David stories about his own childhood. He explained how he grew up poor, how his father was a fisherman and his mother sold vegetables. He wanted David to understand that the past didn't define the future. Hard work could build something completely different. David listened with bright, curious eyes. He asked many questions about school, about life, about the world beyond the streets. Even if the DNA test came back negative, Stephen had already decided he would adopt this boy. He would give him everything he had been denied. On the 3rd day, Stephen's phone rang. His heart stopped. The hospital was calling. He answered with shaking hands. "The results are ready," the voice said. Stephen told David they needed to go pick something up. The boy didn't ask why. He simply followed Stephen to the car. The drive to the hospital was filled with heavy silence. Stephen couldn't speak. His pulse pounded loudly in his ears. At the hospital, the doctor invited them into a private office. Stephen asked David to wait outside for a moment. The boy obeyed and sat quietly on a chair in the hallway. The doctor closed the door and handed Stephen a sealed envelope. Stephen stared at it, unable to move. His entire future, his entire past was inside this paper. With trembling hands, he opened it and scanned the words. His eyes filled with tears. The DNA test was positive. David was his biological son. One of the twins Mary had unknowingly delivered that chaotic day 9 years ago. Stephen sank into a chair and let the tears fall freely. After 9 years of heartbreak and unanswered questions, the truth had finally found him. His son, his living son, had been sleeping under a bridge while he lived in a mansion. When Stephen stepped back into the hallway, his eyes were red. David looked alarmed, thinking something bad had happened. Stephen knelt in front of him and took both his small hands. "David, I have something important to tell you," Stephen said, his voice shaking with emotion. "You got that scar when you were born. I know this because I was there. David, I am your father." David froze. He pulled his hands back and stepped away, shaking his head. "It can't be true," the boy whispered. "I have no father. I have no family. I've always been alone." Stephen's voice softened with deep emotion. "You were taken from me as a baby. I searched everywhere for you. I never gave up hope. The DNA test proves it. We are father and son." David stood still, his eyes filling with tears. He didn't know what to believe. His whole life he had been alone. Now this man was saying he had a father. Slowly David took one step forward, then another. Finally he fell into Stephen's arms. Stephen held him tightly, crying into his hair. David cried too. Years of loneliness, confusion, and fear poured out of him. They stayed like that for a long time. Father and son, finally reunited after 9 painful years. Over the following weeks, Stephen hired investigators to find out what had happened to Mary. The investigators tracked down the ambulance drivers. The younger driver finally confessed the truth. He said masked men with guns had stopped the ambulance and taken Mary and the baby. He had been too afraid to speak for 9 years. The investigators traced the criminals. One of them, now in prison, agreed to talk in exchange for money. He revealed that Dr. Okoro had hired them. Stephen and the police found Dr. Okoro running a small, shabby clinic in a poor neighborhood. When he saw the police, his face turned pale. Terrified, Dr. Okoro confessed everything. He explained his gambling debts and how a wealthy couple had offered him money for a baby. When Mary delivered twins, he saw his chance. He hid the first baby and sold him to the couple. Then he arranged the kidnapping so Mary couldn't reach another hospital and expose what he had done. "What happened to my wife?" Stephen demanded, his fists clenched. Dr. Okoro's voice shook as he spoke. He said Mary had tried to escape with the baby. Still weak from giving birth, she ran into the forest. In the darkness, she stumbled and fell, hitting her head on a rock. She died instantly. The baby slipped from her arms and rolled down a small slope into soft leaves. Dr. Okoro panicked and buried Mary's body quickly. He never saw the baby and assumed the child had died with her. Hours later, an old beggar walking nearby heard a faint cry. He found baby David alive and took him home. Stephen felt the world spinning around him. Mary had died scared and alone, believing her baby had died too. Rage surged through him. He wanted to attack Dr. Okoro, but the police held him back. Dr. Okoro was arrested and later sentenced to life in prison. The investigators also found information about the wealthy couple who had bought the first twin. Their names were Mr. and Mrs. Obi. They lived in Abuja. Stephen's heart pounded. His other son had been living a privileged life all these years, unaware of the truth. With the police, Stephen traveled to Abuja. When Mrs. Obi opened the door and saw the officers, her face drained of color. The Obis confessed everything. They had tried to adopt for years but were always denied. Desperate, they contacted Dr. Okoro and bought a baby. They named him Daniel and raised him as their own. "Where is he?" Stephen asked quietly. "At school," Mrs. Obi said, tears streaming down her face. They went to the school and brought Daniel to the office. The boy looked confused by all the adults staring at him. Stephen studied his face. He saw Mary in his eyes. He saw himself in the boy's jawline. This was his son. When Daniel learned the truth, he cried. He didn't want his life to change. The Obis were the only parents he had ever known. Stephen made a difficult but compassionate decision. Daniel would stay with the Obis during the school year, but spend weekends and holidays with Stephen and David. The boys needed each other. They were twins, separated by tragedy but forever connected. When the brothers finally met, they stared at each other in amazement. Same face but shaped by different worlds. Slowly they began to bond. They played together, talked together, and learned about each other. Stephen enrolled David in a good school. The boy worked harder than anyone, determined to succeed. Together, Stephen and his sons created a foundation called Mary's Hope. It helped homeless children across Nigeria. David never forgot where he came from. He visited the shelter every week, telling children they were worthy of love and opportunity. Years passed. Both boys grew into remarkable men. David became a businessman running Mary's Hope. Daniel became a doctor, helping children who couldn't afford medical care. Stephen lived to see his sons marry and have children of their own. His grandchildren grew up knowing their grandmother's story and learning the importance of kindness. The scars that once caused pain had become symbols of survival and reunion. Stephen often sat in his garden watching his grandchildren play. He thought about the miracle that began with a scar on a television screen. He had lost everything once. But through pain, patience, and an impossible coincidence, he had found his family again. And that made all the difference. We've come to the end of today's story. I hope it touched your heart. Thanks for watching and staying with us till the end. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. See you in the next one. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from?